Erin, the food science babe, welcome to Head on Fire. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So, for people who don't know you or your content, tell people who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so I'm Erin. I'm a food scientist. I've been a food scientist for, over 15 years now, I think. But yeah, I actually went to school for chemical engineering and then out of college got into the food industry, got more into research and development. And so now I consult for a lot of small startup food companies here in the Minneapolis area, doing food product development and some other regulatory consulting. But online, I run my food science babe pages and I try to debunk the plethora of misinformation regarding food that is out there.
And given everything on social media these days, you are a busy person.
Yes.
We are, I want to dive right in. We are surrounded by buzzwords. Social media loves a buzzword. So many of which I'm sure, we're going to parse out in depth a little bit more later on. But I just kind of want to have a question about buzzwords generally speaking. It seems like every year, of course, these days, it seems like every 3 to 6 months, but like every few years, the zeitgeist gets a new buzzword. I remember growing up, it was like various glycerides, I think,
Yeah.
like triglycerides. And,
Yeah,
I
I
remember like
remember that too.
no fat and, all the,
Yeah.
where did just you're in this world? Why do these buzzwords exist? Where do they come from? And how should people engage with a new one when it arises?
Yeah, so I think this happens. I mean, nutrition itself is it's changing all the time. You hear people like, oh, one day they tell us this is unhealthy, the next day they tell us this is healthy. I think buzzwords arise from trying to simplify really sometimes difficult to understand, like research and scientific evidence into something that is easy for people to understand. And in many cases, that ends up being so simplified that it's just not true anymore. It's really easy for people to sell things using these buzzwords, and so that's where you'll see it a lot. You'll see wellness influencers and a lot of people that I debunk using the same keywords over and over again, and they don't explain what it means or provide evidence to show that, like, if they're calling something toxic or nowadays inflammatory is one of the big ones. They'll just say that and it's like, oh my gosh, it's inflammatory, and of course they're selling something. So I think it is really basically just comes down to kind of like a sales tactic, and whatever is trendy at the time in the nutrition world, that's kind of the buzzwords that get a lot of attention and why they change so much.
I do want to talk through some of the most common buzzwords and maybe do a little bit of a fact check. So for people who see this kind of stuff on social media, but maybe haven't gone out of their way to consume science content or content like yours before, start right up here at the top with the one you just mentioned, the word toxic and
Yeah.
toxins and getting rid of the toxins in our body.
Yeah.
What's toxic mean? Is there any such thing as a toxin? Are we really able to purge our bodies of toxins? Are our foods filled with toxins? What's a toxin?
Yeah, so that is a huge thing that you will see not only in the food space, you see it in, skincare products, all that kind of stuff, home products. You'll see people saying, claiming things are toxic and you need to buy this version that doesn't have any toxins. And when people are using the word toxic, if you are claiming something is toxic, I talk about this all the time on my page, you need to be talking about dose, because the dose determines whether something is actually toxic or not. And so if somebody's claiming some food or ingredient is toxic, but they're not at all addressing the dose or sharing evidence that it is toxic at that dose in food, it's not an evidence-based claim. And this word gets thrown around a lot. And of course, it's scary. It scares people. It scares people into buying things that, people are telling them there's an alternative that isn't toxic. But really, I mean, the thing to spot misinformation is, especially with that word, if somebody is claiming something is toxic and they're not saying what dose it is, they're not providing evidence that it's toxic at that dose, you can pretty much ignore it, because a lot of times when it's like a food ingredient and somebody's claiming, oh, this food ingredient is toxic, it's in foods at a very, very low amount. Ingredients are regulated, so they have to, specific preservatives and different additives are regulated to be in foods at amounts that are nowhere near a toxic. So
But at the same time, what you're talking about also kind of reminds me about people that are trying, like you were talking about wellness influencers just a moment ago, about
yeah,
people who are trying to sell something as a superfood because it contains
right,
some new or allegedly rare ingredient or compound or molecule or whatever the
yeah.
new buzzword is that is gonna, it's often fight cancer. I don't know why it's often fight cancer, but for some reason it's some superfood has an ingredient in it that's gonna, make keep you cancer free forever. It's usually
Right.
cancer, but it's all, this I remember red wine was a big one when I was growing
Yes.
up. It was
Yep.
red wine is really good for the heart and you should be drinking red wine. And I think from what I remember, please correct me if I'm wrong, that had to do with resveratrol that was in red
Yeah.
wine. But in order to
Yes.
get the therapeutic benefits, you would have to drink something like 1,000 glasses of red
Correct.
wine a day,
Not
which
to mention alcohol causes cancer. So,
right.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge superfood is another one. I mean, just kind of like these words that don't really, they have, toxic has a meaning, but the way it is being used really no longer has a meaning because it's just being used as a buzzword and it's not being used in the correct way. So, I mean, those are huge red flags when people
Mhm.
are saying words like that, to kind of start questioning it and maybe not just take it at face value.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so really in either direction, if somebody is claiming that something has some, highly therapeutic content, but they're not talking about dose,
Right.
and if there's something that, oh gosh, if you eat this, it's going to kill you, but they're also not talking about dose, that's kind of the same red flag,
Yes.
just two different ways.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, on the opposite end, when you're saying, something is curing something, or, it's never going to be one single food or one single ingredient that is the answer to all cancers, or it's going to have to do with your overall diet. So inflated claims like that too, and sometimes it's difficult because they will link some sort of study that it's like based on some nugget of, but again, it's
Sure,
like,
sure.
yeah, but the dose would have to be this dose that's like impossible to even get. So yeah.
What you're reminding me of something you said up top, that a lot of this misinformation, a lot of these buzzwords come from nuggets of something that somebody puts in a study somewhere, and when you're trying to boil it down and remove it from its context, it becomes something else entirely, as we try to make things more understandable for the, like, click on a headline clickbait audience so that it
Yes.
almost becomes unusable. It
Yep.
reminds me a little bit of quantum physics when I talk to people in quantum that do quantum physics, that you see people, especially like in spiritual realms and some technology realms, talk about like, oh well, quantum physics has proven X, Y, or Z thing, when that's not remotely true.
Yeah.
It's not
Yes.
even
Yeah.
a little bit true, but it's like that whole blinding you with science thing. It's, I'm gonna shove a
Yes.
bunch of technical jargon down your throat to convince you that I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I mean that I feel like has gotten worse just because social media is
Mhm.
so much about engagement, and it's
Mhm.
like people don't have the time to read a study. It's not, easy. I mean, it's not easy even for me to read studies outside the areas that I understand. And
Sure,
so
yeah.
for the general public, I mean, it's like you're going to read a headline, you're going to maybe see that a study was cited, but you're not going to go evaluate the entire study. And so it's becoming more of a problem, I feel like, with social media and people just reading a headline, sharing it, not really understanding what they're sharing, and it just gets way out of hand very quickly.
What kind of brought us together this week was a video where we were talking about processed foods. The
Yep.
word processed is a big one. It's been a big one in the buzzosphere the last few years. So let's just do it. What's a processed food versus what is an ultra processed food? What is the difference? And why has this term gained such a sinister connotation?
Yeah, so the term processed is oftentimes used to indicate something negative. I mean, people use it a lot when they're trying to say like a food is bad for you or
It's
unhealthy.
toxic.
Yeah, exactly, right. So there are set definitions which are not perfect obviously because you can't always say that the degree of processing correlates with the healthfulness or nutrient density of a food, but of course when they are studying these things they do have to set definitions for them.
Mhm.
However, these terms are being used by consumers again to just indicate that something is, horrible for you, toxic for you, unhealthy for you. And that's really not helpful to consumers because, I mean, you cook something, that's a process. You bake a loaf of bread, that's a processed food. And so it's just not helpful to not be adding any nuance to it when you're talking about processed foods and ultra processed foods. And of course, there are different foods that are going to have different nutrient densities, some that you should be eating more of, and some that you should be eating less of in your diet. But when it comes to saying, cut out all ultra processed foods, they're horrible, they're toxic, I mean, that's just not true. They can be a part of an overall balanced and healthy diet. So really it's more helpful
And
to
not all of them are made equally. I mean, from
correct.
you're the
Yes.
expert here,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
like I talked about in the video that we were that kind of brought us
Yeah.
back together to do this interview.
Yep.
Processing could be as simple as taking a tomato off a vine, going inside and washing it. Like
Right.
that's
So
technically
yeah.
processing the food. And an ultra processed food, that from what I understand, the definition of it is just like it's made by an industrial process. So anything as simple as like bread, like
Right.
basic bread on a shelf at the grocery store is
Right.
technically an ultra processed food. Yogurt or
Yeah.
tofu, all
Yep.
of these are ultra processed foods. So when somebody says it as a scare tactic, they're removing the context that, well, no, I mean, what you're
Yeah.
thinking of is, of course, like, Trix cereal or something like that,
Right.
which
I mean, and
still in and
it's
of itself isn't inherently a bad thing. And there's no moral weight
right.
to any of it.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, blanket statements about just a whole category of foods that, are can be so different from one to the other, to just say all ultra processed foods are this or all processed foods are this. I mean, it's very unhelpful because
Mhm.
it does just lead to people thinking like I need to cut this out of my diet entirely when that doesn't need to be the case. It also a lot of times has, I mean, it's there are people that live in food deserts and don't have access sometimes to more of these more nutrient dense foods, and there are issues with our food system. There
Sure.
very
Oh,
much are.
100%. Yeah. Like you just mentioned,
But
food deserts are a big one. I
yeah,
mean, there's a lot
yeah,
of places where, oh, well, just go get fresh food. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. So I don't want to derail. But
yeah, yeah.
I
So
mean,
yeah, when you
yeah,
have
there's a big problem.
access, right? When you have access to maybe a higher percentage of your diet is made up of processed foods just because that's what you have access to, and then somebody's telling you like, oh my gosh, everything you're eating is toxic, when that's not the case. It's just you have to people have to understand too that this leads to a lot of anxiety that is also harmful for your health. And so I just think there is so much
Mm.
nuance that is not covered. And again, it's social media, right? Like a video, a 1 minute it's hard for me to debunk these things too, because it's like a 30-second clip of somebody saying a processed food is toxic. For me to like debunk that, I have to take a longer time, I have to be more nuanced, and people don't watch it. And so
That's why so many of my videos are like 7, 8, 9 minutes long. And I'm like,
yeah.
okay, I understand that it would just be so much easier if I gave you a 15-second nugget because that's the
Right.
thing that's going to go viral. But me sitting here and saying, okay, no, let's go back through the history of how this
Yeah.
sociological term became probably like,
A lot of times it's not as interesting of
yeah,
information to
yeah, yeah.
actually,
It's
like
probably dry.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a reason I wear a lot of cutoff shirts because at least people will watch for a while.
There you go. I need something to get people to watch my
There
videos.
you go.
They're
Take your
boring.
shirt off. It works. Uh, actually, oh my God, they tried that. Don't you remember Naked News in the early 2000s?
No, I don't. I don't. I believe it though.
Oh God. Okay. Here's a big one, and I feel like this one starts getting into a lot of the areas of this feeds into other things. GMO.
Yeah.
What? First of all, what is a GMO?
Okay, so I hate the way people use it because a GMO doesn't really make sense. Genetic modification is a tool to modify food, and there are many different ways that crops are modified. There's selective breeding, there's some of these things that have been used for a very long time for farmers to modify crops. And so genetic modification is essentially a more precise way to modify fewer genes so we understand what the outcome is going to be. It's because it's just more a precise process. And so it's used again, to make blanket statements to say all GMOs are this or all GMOs
Mhm.
are that doesn't make any sense because every single every single food in the store that is genetically modified, if there's going to be a claim about it, it needs to be very specific to that food. If there's some data on some GMO, I'll just call it that because that is what consumers call it,
Sure.
there would need to be some evidence specifically about that. And the evidence shows that GMOs or genetically engineered, bioengineered is what you're going to see on labels now, that these foods are just as safe and at least as nutritious as their non-GMO counterparts. And the non-GMO label has really perpetuated a lot of misinformation and just confusion to consumers just because that label is on so many things that don't even have a GMO counterpart, like a carton of orange juice. There are no GMO oranges, and so a consumer will see that non-GMO label, and it's to say something doesn't contain something and a consumer doesn't necessarily know what that means. I mean, it's like, why would they have that label on there? It must be something that we should be avoiding, right?
Sure. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that's not the case. So it's unfortunate that that label has created so much confusion, and now
Well,
the
it's a
US.
response to fear mongering. I mean, it's a
Oh, for
response to,
sure.
I don't want
Yeah.
any GMOs in my food. I got to avoid
Yeah.
GMOs.
And
So
that
if
yeah,
you
and
put if you put your non-GMO on your orange juice, even though there are no genetically modified oranges, somebody might be more likely to buy your orange juice.
right, exactly. I mean, right now it's a market. I call it it's a fear-based marketing label is what I
Hmm.
call it because it is a marketing label. I mean, I've worked at companies that I am the person that gets their product non-GMO verified. Actually, that's when I kind of started questioning it a little bit myself because 10 years ago, I was a consumer that believed a lot of these things that I debunk now. And that questioning actually started when I worked for that company where I got their products verified. And I was kind of realizing like, this doesn't mean anything for the end food product in terms of safety or nutrition. A lot of times it is a way to just market your product as, that healthy halo marketing to make consumers think it's
Mm.
healthier than maybe an alternative product sitting on the shelf next to it that doesn't have that label on it. But I mean, there's
Can I ask
overwhelming. Yep.
why? Can I ask why foods are, to use the term, genetically modified? Like, what is it oftentimes? I realize that blanket statements are the death of nuance, but most often say why is this process done?
So there's different reasons for foods to be there's different traits that would be selected for. So sometimes it's Roundup Ready crops, herbicide tolerance. So you can spray the field, get rid of weeds, but that crop won't die. There's non-browning traits
Mm.
that are so for like apples. There's
Mhm.
non-browning apples to reduce food waste. So there's a lot of different traits that can be selected for different reasons. Could be, a agricultural reason at the consumer level, them throwing out less food. So there, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things, reasons why a crop might be modified. And again, crops have been modified for, a very, very long time. This is just a more precise way of doing it now that we have the technology to do.
So I've heard fact checks like this one on
Mm-hmm.
GMOs before, and similar to the fact check on the term processed, and seen the feedback that the answer doesn't address the concern that people have. So I want to try to attack that very directly based
Yep.
on some feedback from some listeners when I told them that I was going to be doing this interview. The concern that folks have of what happens when you are, as one of my followers put it, in a lab setting, cutting and replacing DNA to create a genetically modified organism. I have multiple questions here. One, are we in lab settings cutting and modifying DNA in food? Is that happening at all? My second question, does this have if this is happening, does this have any effect on the human body? And number 3, very specifically because I promised I would ask this, are there any generational studies done on genetically modified organisms, and if so, what are their findings?
Yeah, I have a whole GMO highlight on my page going into all of this. And so when we're talking about modifying genes, I mean, yes, this stuff is done in a lab setting. And that's, I think, another like term that people use to indicate something like scary is
Mm-hmm.
happening. Uh, so yes, genes are being altered in a lab setting, but again, that also happens with other ways of modifying crops that we've been using for hundreds of years that aren't considered to be GMO. So the again, like, yes, you are modifying genes. However, what matters, just that in and of itself, I think scares people, and I'm not
But it sounds
exactly
like, from what
sure.
I'm understanding, it sounds like the reason why we're doing this in a lab setting is precision instead of just
Yes,
being
yep.
out in the field with Mendel and his peas.
Well, yeah. So there's, yeah, crossbreeding ways. It takes a longer time to get to where you want to get to, and it's not necessarily, you can't get to the outcome as quickly. There's another way I've talked about, mutagenesis, where they basically blast seeds with radiation, and there's like random mutations that come about because of that. So you're changing genes that way. That's a very random process. That process is not considered GMO. So the things that it's it's frustrating because there's ways of genetically modifying crops that are, people, I don't know, like, not as bad or scary, and those are not considered to be GMO. And that's why I hate the term GMO, because there are GMOs that are not considered to be GMO essentially. So that's just put on these more modern ways of doing it that are very precise, changing, very few genes, where these other ways are changing like thousands of genes at a time, and then we're just like trying to figure out like, oh, what did it change? But what matters in all of these processes, regardless of the way that you are modifying a crop, what matters is the end product that is created. And the studies are done on that end product. And so there's safety studies done, so that's what matters. So it does the process to get there. What matters is the safety of the end product. And what's interesting is that these ways of modifying crops that result in a crop that is considered a GMO are regulated so much more heavily than these other processes that are older, that are not considered GMO. They're not only more precise, but they're so much more heavily regulated. And so we have, more studies with those products that are created this way, just because they are so heavily regulated. And so it's just wild to me that like people would assume the other ways, that aren't considered GMO are safer, when in actuality, like, these more modern ways, and you're changing fewer genes, they're way more regulated, there's way more research on them. Somehow that's still, consumers think that those are still unsafe, and they're not. I mean, the evidence shows that they are just as safe and at least as nutritious as their non-GMO counterparts. So
So, from what I'm understanding, just so I can give as clear of an answer to listeners as possible, this is not having some wildly transformative
no,
effect on the human body. It's not altering our DNA in some kind of way. We are
no, I
not
mean, it's
being,
like, it's like saying if you eat a banana that somehow like
you're going to
those
become
genes
slightly more
are,
banana ish.
yeah, I mean, it's just, you would have to apply that to everything we eat then, right? Not just, I mean, not just these things that have been genetic. Yeah, it's just, it doesn't make any sense because you're not eating a banana and becoming a banana. So yeah.
Chemicals. Chemicals, just generally speaking, chemicals. Oh my God, I don't want chemicals in my food. Is everything chemicals? Uh, you're welcome.
Yes.
There's an easy question for you. There's so many chemicals in our food. What are the chemicals that people are allegedly afraid of? Like, oh God, there's all these preservatives and dyes and all of that. Are they doing anything to our body? What should I be concerned about chemicals? I've heard lots of advice on this, like don't eat anything with an ingredient that your grandmother, I think, or great grandmother wouldn't recognize as food, even though I think like my great grandmother would probably be sent into a coma by the idea of guacamole or something. So like I'm
Yeah,
not entirely sure
my
how good
grandma
that
would have
advice
no
is.
idea what quinoa is. So yeah, I mean, it's just like those little like things that people say, and it's like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Like, if you can't pronounce it, you shouldn't be eating it. All these different things. Everything that we consume is made up entirely of chemicals. So if anyone's saying
Water's a
just
chemical, H2O.
exactly like that, again, that's not helpful for consumers to say chemicals are bad. I mean, it's like that doesn't make any sense. And even saying like broad categories, like, I'll see a lot of times like avoid preservatives, those are bad for you. It's like, what do you mean? Like, you need to be specific. Like, preservatives are a huge category of many different ingredients. If you're trying to make a claim about some specific preservative, make a claim about a specific preservative then and provide evidence that it is, causing something at the dose in foods. Because again, dose matters for everything. It matters for all these different categories of ingredients that you're going to hear people make blanket statements about. Preservatives is one that really bothers me because preservatives are there to make foods safer, make them
Mhm.
last longer, reduce risk of foodborne illness, a lot of times reduce food waste again. And so it just really bothers me that that whole category is just demonized. And again, nobody is, when you see those claims, like, again, a good way to spot that misinformation is just, are they making a specific claim about a specific ingredient? If they are they providing a dose and are they supporting that claim with evidence at that dose in foods? And most times, they're not. And again, these things are regulated. And so they are in foods at, there's some different ones are regulated to ensure that they're not in foods at an unsafe amount. And when I say that too, it's not, people are like, oh, well, it's in so many different foods over the course of a day, it's creating a harmful amount. And that's not true. I mean, the safety studies that are done, if something is set at a certain level, it's to ensure that consumers are not even coming close to a harmful level. And so, yeah, I
I
just,
really like when somebody tries to take the chemical argument and they're like, "Well, this chemical isn't even allowed in dog food." And I'm like, "Okay, well, my dog also can't eat chocolate." Like I don't
right. Yes.
that's not
That doesn't
that's
make
not the flex you
sense.
think it is. Different
Yeah.
I know crazy, I
Right.
realize, but different species can
Yeah.
eat fully fine
Yeah. I
different
mean,
kinds of
we,
foods.
we can eat chocolate. Dogs,
Dogs can't. There's things
dogs
that my
cannot eat
rabbit
chocolate.
can eat that my dog and cat
Right.
cannot. But my
Right.
cat can eat stuff, like my
Right.
cat's food is filled with salts. My dog's food can't have any of that. Like it's a
Yeah.
whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you get, I don't know if this was maybe one of your questions, but I'll just talk about, I'm assuming you were probably going to talk about the band in Europe stuff if you know about that. But yeah,
Yep.
so that's when
Yeah.
that comes in, like, oh, this ingredient is banned in another country.
Oh man, but the folks on social media, especially Europeans, who just
Yeah.
love to. It's an endless debate about the bread in Europe and the
Yeah, I
chocolate
mean,
in Europe.
it's
Oh
a
my
lot of time
god.
it is people from the US. I mean, it is just like the misinformation is so pervasive. It's just like It's so frustrating. This is something I've covered so many times, and I can't, like, I'm just like, I can't cover this anymore. It's like getting ridiculous. But I mean, I'm just keep sharing old videos. But yeah, just because an ingredient is banned in another country does not mean that you can just say, therefore, it is unsafe at the amounts in foods. Believe it or not, the regulatory frameworks of the US and the EU are very similar. People will lead you to believe that they are very different, but they're not. They're very similar. Different regulatory agencies can look at the exact same evidence and maybe come to a different conclusion. So something that might be banned in Europe, maybe it is still approved in the US, and we just regulate the amounts that can be in foods. And it
Mm.
the big thing that people the big thing that is not ever the narrative is that it goes both ways. There are
Hmm.
ingredients that are banned in the US that
Hmm.
are allowed in Europe. And I would never make the argument that that means that, Europe is using toxic, harmful ingredients, because just because it is banned somewhere doesn't mean that it is toxic or harmful at the amounts in
Well, and there's
foods.
lots of context between, like, the US may ban something because something may have to be in a truck longer and in different kinds of conditions and
Yeah,
sit
or
on a
just like
shelf longer.
something, yeah,
And in
something
Europe,
is
things can get
grown
to consumers
more,
faster because it's
yeah.
so much smaller.
There can be economic reasons, political
Sure.
reasons for bans. I mean, it's not even it's
Oh man, that's such a great point. There's so many times when food regulation is created out of political
yeah.
motivations, like they're
Yeah.
trying to keep a contingent of farmers happy. So
Right.
they create legislation that says this food is good or this food is bad, or they're trying to
Yeah.
do business with a different country and that country
Yep.
happens to export this thing. And
Yeah.
even though the US doesn't have it, well, some European country might really need that ally. So they're going to say that that's great. And I think that
Yep.
the political motivations for food laws and food conversations are not discussed enough.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, so for example, people would say like, "Oh, why doesn't Europe use high fructose corn syrup?" They do. It is labeled differently, so you won't see it as high fructose corn syrup. But there was a production quota at one time because of economic reasons, and so it wasn't being used as much. And just like we grow more corn here, like
I
so it's going to be used more
was going
here.
to say, I don't know about all those massive cornfields in
Yeah.
London.
So yeah, it's like you can't just assume that, oh, it's not used there or it's banned there or whatever it is, therefore it is unsafe. A lot
We
of
do
times
treat Europe like it's like some kind of fantasy world. We really do. We get
yeah,
this
there
this
is,
strange halo effect. Like if somebody's talking to
yes.
you in an English accent and whatever they do there, it's just like they're all magical elves over there or
Yeah,
something, and
it's
everything they do
it's
is
just
perfect.
yeah, and I get like there are health disparities between different countries. You can point to one and say, "Oh, it must be the food. It must be the difference in the food." And it's like you can't just conclude that. And also, like, what else is there's so many other things. I mean, like access to healthcare, like just
Mhm.
access to food insecurity. Like, there's so many different things that are different between these countries you're comparing. You can't just say like, oh, it must be because of this food that's banned. Like, that just doesn't make sense.
There are conversations around types of diets on social media. So, briefly, I'm sure this could be a whole thing in and of itself. But speaking of the differences in food, there's a lot of debate over the difference between like a plant based diet, an omnivorous diet, and even the burgeoning carnivore diet. Are
Yeah.
there any unique benefits or downsides to any of these? Is it all about dose and moderation?
Well, I would refer to dietitians
Yes.
in
Yeah, I
in
did
the
try to tailor my questions in a
yeah.
way that I
No,
realized that yours is about the actual
I
production of food, not
yeah.
necessarily what's healthy for us to eat.
I try not to. I like to share a lot. There's many different great dietitians that I typically share
We've
content when
had
it
some on
comes
the
to
show,
like,
yeah.
yeah, like specific diets. I try not to, that's not my area of expertise. I will say there are a lot of I mean, like, there's fad diets all the
Sure.
time.
Yeah.
Fad diets in general are not going to be sustainable. So yeah, I guess on that topic, that's
Can I
probably
can
all.
I can I say something
Yeah,
that
yeah,
you're not saying?
yep.
You're not saying it. I'm saying it. The carnivore Oreos are stupid. That's stupid. Just eat an
Wait,
Oreo. Just eat a
carnivore
frickin'
Oreos?
Oreo.
I don't even wanna know what that is. I don't wanna
Oh
know
my god,
what
there's the
it
people on the
is.
carnivore diet, which is like everything has to be meat except for all
Yeah,
the stuff they eat that isn't meat, and they're
yeah.
making like carnivore Oreos out of like
Oh my
dried ground beef.
gosh.
It's disgusting. I will send it to you. You're welcome.
Please don't.
Why can't we drink raw milk?
Please do
Marjorie
not
Taylor
drink
Greene's new favorite
ramen.
thing.
Oh my goodness. This has blown up recently. I've
It
done so many
has.
posts
Why? It's
about
back. It's
I don't
back.
it's this whole yeah.
I thought pasteurization was a great thing.
It is a great thing. So, pasteurized milk is just as nutritious and it is safer than unpasteurized milk. Unpasteurized milk presents a unnecessary food safety risk. Pasteurization is implemented for a reason. It increases food safety. And
What
so,
is the
yeah,
risk with raw milk, though? Like, what is the specific concern?
so it's different bacteria that are not, pasteurization kills those bacteria. And so these harmful bacteria that can remain in raw milk can cause foodborne illness. I mean, some pretty nasty ones. And so there's no reason. I mean, you'll hear there's a lot of misinformation regarding people will say there's benefits to, different things are killed in pasture, but it's not true. Pasteurized milk is the same nutrition wise. There's no significant differences nutrition wise, and it presents a higher risk of foodborne illness. And so it's just there's literally no reason why people should be. I mean, and the big thing too is like, if you're a full grown adult and you know the risks and you still want to consume it because you think it's tastier or whatever, whatever. But people are feeding it to their children, and they even they're at an even higher risk for these foodborne illnesses. And so, giving it to somebody that is immunocompromised or elderly, like these things that they're already at an increased risk for foodborne illnesses, and then you're giving them a food that unnecessarily increases that risk. There's just no reason for it.
I never see these raw milk people going out and like drinking pond water or
Yeah,
something. Like
right.
they seem to understand that like, oh well, I'm obviously going to drink the water that has
Yes,
been, I don't know, boiled and then filtered, and I'm
right.
at least going to drink the water that doesn't have all the icky in it. But raw milk, that's
Yeah.
probably fine.
Well,
That's great.
there was actually a raw water movement for a while. I don't even want to bring that
No,
up, but
I missed that.
that
No,
was a
really?
thing. Yeah, so
Ooh.
I wouldn't put it past them, but yeah, it's
Stick a
just
straw in a pond. Yummy,
yeah.
yummy.
Yeah.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
Yeah.
This was an interesting question. This wasn't on my radar. A listener of mine clued me into it. There's a growing movement called rebel canning that rejects or disputes many of the modern home canning practices tested and endorsed by the USDA in favor of methods that fall on a spectrum from untested and questionably effective to proven to be unreliable or unsafe. How did we get here, and how do we guide practitioners towards a more science-based approach? I had never heard of rebel canning, but I mean, I will say I've noticed on social media there is more of a movement towards the whole homesteading, trad wife, traditional methods of food preparation, and canning seems to be making a kind of revival. So I hadn't heard of rebel canning. Have you heard of this?
I have. I actually made
Okay.
a video covering dry canning potatoes, which is not something you should do.
What dry
There
can is that just sticking it in a can?
Yeah, like no water around. I mean, so there's a reason for that liquid around food when you can it. Canning is a
That doesn't
science.
seem safe.
Yeah, it's not. So it just goes along with the distrust of, these regulatory, the FDA, the USDA. So of course, when you say, "Hey, go to the USDA website," they have
Oh,
validated
that's automatic.
recipes.
That's
Yeah, it's
automatic. Well,
like,
if you're trusting the
whoa,
USDA, I
yeah,
automatically throw all of that out. Yeah.
exactly. And so, canning is great. If you want to can at home, that's great, but you have to know what you're doing. Or again, you could get some really, really bad foodborne illness if you're
Mhm.
not doing it correctly, if you're not following validated recipes and that's where that movement came from. It's just the distrust of these government agencies, and you're unnecessarily increasing your risk of foodborne illness. It's just there's no reason for it. They if you go to the USDA, and I've shared it, I can share it again. But yeah, they have a specific website that has canning recipes for everything that you would want to can. And if you want to can potatoes, go to the website, go, follow the recipe and the process that is there, because if you don't, again, you're just unnecessarily increasing your risk of foodborne illness, and there's no reason you should be doing that. So, yeah.
This
Again, and like,
question,
what is the USDA gaining from, like you're,
well,
it's just
they're
like,
in
what are
league
they? It's like
with
free information. Like what? Why would they? It just doesn't make sense.
Uh, this question broke my heart a little bit, but I sympathize greatly. This one also came in from a listener who said, "If I'm going to eat fast food, are there certain options that are more or less nutritious?" So, like, I received this question. It made me a little sad. It says, "When I'm struggling to cook, mental health reasons, time wise, whatever, is it better to get fast food or not eat dinner?" So I realize that we're not going to be talking about diet here. I do want to
Yeah.
talk about maybe some of the misinformation around fast food,
So
generally speaking.
yeah, so that is actually a great example of when we talked previously about demonizing processed foods. Um, like fast food, or just like more accessible foods in,
Mhm.
the frozen section, these things you can just pop in the microwave. I mean, to demonize that when, somebody is like, "Hey, I'm disabled. Like I
Yeah.
can't cut my own, like these are ways that allow me to have food to eat, and people are telling it's toxic." Like, obviously you should be eating versus, oh my gosh, it's toxic, I should just not, skip a meal because I'm afraid to eat fast food or this accessible processed food. And so that's really where that harm really comes in, is like when somebody is struggling like that and is like, oh my gosh, like I maybe don't have access, or I just don't have the ability right now to cook something, and I
Mhm.
want to go get a meal. Obviously, yes, like go eat. Like you need to
Eat.
eat.
Yes,
Yes.
that is best. Always
So
best.
yeah, and again, I will defer to dietitians specifically. Like if you need help with your diet, see a dietitian, and they have great ways of like incorporating a pack of frozen vegetables with, like in some sort of like easy to cook noodle, something where you can get a meal cooked, but it's not like a lot of effort. And again, a lot of times those processed foods that allow you to do that are demonized, and that's where that harm comes in.
You mentioned frozen. I do want to ask, fresh versus frozen versus canned. Is there any truth that one is better for us? Are they all good in different ways? Food deserts and inflation mean that food is more expensive for everyone right now.
Yes.
But frozen foods, prepared meals, heat up dinners, these are an affordable option for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Which, frozen vegetables came up also in that video that kind of brought us together today. There's a lot of shame that's carried
Hmm.
with, well, I filled up my freezer with great value vegetable, great value broccoli and great value frozen potatoes and great value this, that, and the other. Um, it, what's the deal? Fresh, frozen, canned, all of that.
Yeah. Again, I'm not a dietitian, but I would
Yep.
say
No, we're not talking about should you
yep.
eat. Yeah, we're
No, but
talking about
I
the
do want to
science
say,
behind the
yep.
value between each of these.
Yeah. I just want to, like, if I can leave people with one thing about that, is whatever way you can get fruits and vegetables into your diet, whatever way you have access to, whatever way that is convenient for you, do that. I hate getting into the nuances of like these tiny little like nutritional differences between like frozen versus like you know what I mean? Like it's like whatever, if I didn't buy frozen vegetables, I would have way fewer vegetables in my diet.
I
Like
would throw so many. I mean,
yeah, I would have
man,
so much more food waste.
I am never more overconfident than when I buy like
Same. Yes.
zucchini. at the store and
Yeah.
stick it in my little basket of produce. I'm going to
Yep.
cook you this time. I swear to God, I'm going to cook you. I'm going to chop you. I'm going to roast you. I'm going to cook you. And then a
Yeah.
week later, I'm throwing away a nasty, rotten something that I did not eat because I
Exactly.
did not have
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. And so, like, to have shame around a way that allows you to get more vegetables into your diet just doesn't make any sense. Access is a huge issue. If you only have access to canned, buy canned. The one thing with canned, I will say, is that sometimes there can be higher sodium. You can, if that's an issue for you, you can rinse them before consuming them. But
Oh,
otherwise, really just whatever you have access to get more fruits and vegetables into your diet
I didn't.
is what you
That's
should
news
do.
to me. I didn't know that rinsing a
Yeah,
canned
because a
product
lot of times it's
reduces the
just
sodium.
yeah, because a lot of times it's in that like water that's around
Oh,
it.
the
So
broth around it.
yeah, yeah,
I
yep.
didn't know
So
that. Oh,
yeah, so
that's
drain
nice
it
to
and
know.
rinse it.
I don't
Yeah,
know
if you need
why
to
I
get rid of
thought
it.
it was like in the food somehow, but
There
yeah,
might
that makes
still be a
sense.
little bit more, but
Sure.
yeah, you can get rid of most of it by draining it and rinsing it. So yeah,
News to me. Well, thank you. That I have
yeah.
learned something today. So, let's see. I want to be really respectful of your time here. Another question from a listener. With the recent listeria outbreak in deli meat, what products tend to be the highest risk for foodborne illness? Is that a thing that can even be quantified, or are all of them open to foodborne illness? And how can we most effectively reduce our risk of contracting or causing a case of foodborne illness? I will say listeria hits home for me personally because I grew up in Texas
Mm,
where we had Bluebell ice cream.
yep. I remember that. Yeah.
Now, Bluebell ice cream had a listeria outbreak, and we were out of Bluebell ice cream down in Texas for like
Hmm.
years. And I remember getting a text from my mother who was like, I mean, like the people on social, like my friends and family down in Texas were like, I don't think you understand. I mean, I do understand. I
Yeah.
don't think you understand. We don't eat other types of ice cream. Us being out of Bluebell means we are out of ice cream. So
Yeah.
like listeria is like a bit like, oh God, it's so scary. And as you know, oh man,
Yeah.
I remember the Bluebell was out for years because they had to like clean the tanks and sanitize, like the entire process had to like be stopped. Every piece of equipment had to be like
Yeah.
examined or replaced or sanitized, and then production could begin again. And that took a long time to get going. So
Oh, for sure.
sorry
Yeah.
to go
Yeah.
there.
No, outbreaks like
Foodborne
that
illness.
can put companies out of business. So
Oh yeah, the fact that Bluebell survived is wild.
I know. Yeah, that is. But yeah, I mean, I've worked in manufacturing facilities. Familiar with food safety regulations. I want to reiterate that our food is very, very safe. Of course, yes, we do have foodborne illness outbreaks, and hopefully the recall is very fast before too many people are affected. But it does. The foods that are going to be higher risk are foods that are higher in moisture, bacteria,
Hmm.
like moisture. So that's why like things that are drier cereal, crackers, these things can last longer. There's not really much of a risk of foodborne illness with those products. Like they'll just go stale or maybe they'll get rancid, but you're not really
Well,
going
that's
to
a
get
risk. You ever been into like some stale
that is a
Reese's
risk.
cereal? It's a
Yeah.
rough time.
Yeah, rancid like chips or something, not good. But yeah, you're
Hmm.
not, typically not going to get sick from those types of foods just because it's not like a bacterial thing. It's more like, oh, this smells rancid, or yeah, it got stale. So yeah, the foods like deli meats high in moisture, things in your refrigerator, perishable foods. Of course, like you can never get your risk of it to zero. Food is very safe. There, like I would say, it is hard because like you can't necessarily see or smell listeria on something, and so it can happen. But I mean, yes, those things, it is rare. It is rare. It might not seem like it is because it does seem like, every day there's like another outbreak or another
Sure. Oh
recall or
yeah.
whatever. But when you think about how much food is actually produced and consumed, like it is very rare.
Statistically rare. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so, people that are maybe immunocompromised have higher risk for things like that. You know, romaine lettuce is one that I would
Hmm.
say like
I
is,
remember.
higher risk. Like maybe if you are immunocompromised or something like that, like, if there is something like that, maybe avoiding it, or, you know, doesn't really apply to lettuce because you don't really cook it, but like you maybe using it in something that is cooked versus just eating it
I
raw,
don't know.
because
I've had
that
a
will.
grilled salad before. It was good.
That's true. Yeah, there are ways of doing it, but yeah, that would reduce your risk if you are cooking it or heating it up or
So things
something
that
like that.
contain a lot of water, a lot of moisture, stuff where bacteria can
Yeah.
hide, that inherently
Yeah.
creates a larger risk. But to
Yep.
mitigate our risk, one, let's just keep apprised of any new developments in,
Yes.
in
Yep.
recalls and safety and all of that,
Yep.
and try and cook your food
Yeah. Yes.
when
Yeah.
and
If
how you can.
Yep. Don't
Food
eat raw meat.
allergens.
That's another trend.
Oh,
Just don't eat don't
I
eat.
didn't know if I wanted to go down the rabbit hole of like why can I eat like rare meat like beef, but I can't eat rare chicken?
Oh,
Oh
well,
God,
yeah. Yes.
you
I
remember the
mean,
medium rare chicken from a few years ago
oh
on
god.
social media?
Please
People
do
are like,
not
"Oh, I
eat
love medium rare chicken."
please do not eat medium rare or raw chicken, please. That will increase your risk of foodborne illness for sure. So don't do
Uh,
that. Cook chicken.
okay, but since we're here, why can I do it with red meat, but I can't do it like beef from a cow, but I can't do it with chicken? Like, what's the big difference? Like, what's
So yes, and also like the big thing there is making sure, like, with a steak you can do that. There is not that risk for, salmonella, E. coli. Yes, for like, so anytime like something is touching that, it is obviously like going to put it, so like a burger, for example, like, you I know this is probably very controversial, but you do want that to be like cooked through, because there is an increased risk when it comes to that. When it comes to
really?
steak, yes, because like that is ground, and so
Because there's been
that's
more process, there's more
so
air
you're
and
touching,
moisture and
yeah,
stuff
so
inside
whereas
of it.
like the middle of a
Gotcha.
steak, um that's not the case. But raw chicken can carry things like salmonella, and so cooking that gets rid of
Is it
that
just different
risk.
bacteria like different kinds of like to live in different
Yeah.
kinds of environments? And chicken is just
Yeah.
one of those environments?
Yeah, so right.
Oh,
Yeah, so there's
okay.
just different, I mean, yeah, so that's why like poultry, like, you're not going to eat like raw hopefully you're not eating raw poultry or not cooking it through.
I
So
will
yeah,
never
there
in
are
my whole
different,
life forget medium rare chicken. It was
yeah,
oh man, being on social media
don't
and
do
seeing
that.
people medium rare chicken, that upset me physically for months.
Yeah, don't do
Food
that.
allergens. I got a question from a listener that made me want to ask a different question, so I'm going to tell you the whole thing, and I'm sure this is actually fairly. I'm sure your answer is going to be shorter than my question. They said that due to a specific food sensitivity, they are having to eliminate tomatoes from their diet and they're struggling to do so. They asked why tomatoes are so ubiquitous and if there are any alternatives to tomatoes. My greater question is about food sensitivities in general. I've seen a lot of chatter on social media about how more people are allergic to more foods, and there's all sorts of wild misinformation as to why this is. Oh, it's the GMOs, it's the chemicals, it's all of that, it's making us be allergic to it. Are food sensitivities increasing? Are they actually increasing, or are we simply getting better at identifying them? I see this like in issues with mental health as well. It's like, oh gosh, people are just blah 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 these days. Well, no, we're just getting better at identifying and diagnosing it.
Right.
Or, so what causes food sensitivities and what can be done if you have one?
So I do want to differentiate between an allergy and a sensitivity.
Oh, okay. I
So
okay. This
yeah,
I'll learn
so
something.
I'm not an allergist. There is an allergist that you should go to your allergist if you have questions about sensitivity or an allergy. There are
Okay.
these
I didn't
at
realize there
home
was a difference.
tests. Yeah, there are these at home tests that you can do for, they say they tell you food sensitivities. They don't. There's not a test for that. So when somebody says the increase in food sensitivities, it could be because people are taking these at-home tests that are telling them
Mm.
that they have sensitivities. I don't want to downplay the fact that like people might have a sensitivity. So when I say that, I'm not saying that you're not having a sensitivity or you're not having an issue. That's not
So
that.
then what's the difference? Because I think all of these, and I think that they all live in the same place in my brain. So I think, oh, I eat something and it causes a deleterious reaction. So, oh, I eat something and my throat swells up. I
So
eat
that would
something
be
and I
an
get a migraine.
allergy. Yeah,
Okay.
so an allergy would be an actual, so you can go to your allergist and you can get tests done to determine if you have
So
an
what is a food
allergy.
sensitivity then?
So a sensitivity, and this is not my area of expertise. I don't know like technically what an allergist would consider like a
Okay.
sensitivity, but there is not a test for a sensitivity. So it would be more like maybe they would do like an elimination diet to determine like, if you do think something is giving you, I get migraines, for example. I've done an elimination diet to see like, oh, if I take this food out and then I add it back in, like, is that, so that's a way you can kind of determine different sensitivities. Again, please go to your allergist. Don't do an elimination diet on your own. Please don't do that on your own. But yeah, so there's a certain
Doing my
like,
own at-home double-blind studies.
please don't. Yeah. So yeah, sensitivities, I feel like that seems to have increased just because it is almost more like a self diagnosis, and there are these at home tests that aren't
Okay.
really like, that aren't really telling you but yeah, if you have any concerns with any of that, please go to your doctor. Please get an allergy
It's
test
sort of
done.
in the same realm of almost the buzzword thing of like I
Yes, very
remember
much.
when
Yeah.
people started talking, celiac disease became more visible.
Yep.
Gluten-free food became a buzzword, and
Yes.
people and gluten sensitivity and got all wrapped up in it being a
Yes.
health food and
Right.
a wellness trend, and it all gets wrapped up. And
Yep.
okay, okay, I
Yeah, no,
see.
that's a good one too, because even like somebody with celiac disease, that's not the same as somebody that might have some like just vague like gluten sensitivity that there wouldn't be a test for, but maybe like you did an elimination diet. So yeah, there are differentiations in like celiac or gluten sensitivity or like allergy versus sensitivity. So yeah.
And you could have none of those. and
Yes.
and it
Gluten is
and
not
then just eating
inherently
that food
bad.
doesn't really
Yes.
do anything for
That
you.
that was a just like the non-GMO label, like you stick a gluten-free. I mean, I remember
Oh
seeing it
yeah.
for the first time
Oh
in stores,
yeah.
and I was like, "What is gluten? And like, why should I be avoiding it? Like, why
Yeah.
are like why?"
Gluten-free bananas,
Yeah,
gluten-free
it's just
apples,
like,
like gluten-free
man,
everywhere. It's like, well,
yeah,
was there gluten in that to begin with? And is
right.
it bad? Do
That
I
too,
want my
yeah.
food
Well,
gluten-free?
right, yeah.
I want to end on a hopeful note here before I let you go. So, are there any technological developments for food on the horizon that excite you?
Oh, good question. I'm really interested in like uh the plant-based space. I feel
Oh
like
yeah. Yeah. Man,
people
I
call
feel
it
like that
lab
is
grown
going
meat to
leaps
kind of
and
scare people,
bounds.
but
Yeah.
I think that area is very and so yeah, I'm very interested in that and just like how that is going to be, if some of these things are going to get scaled up and be more available at, more widely available in the
Yeah, I'm
future.
one of
But
those people when they're like when people are like, "You wouldn't eat a printed steak." I would. I would
I would
100 I would
I would too.
100% eat the printed steak.
I would like
I
to try that.
listen,
Yeah.
I am a reluctant omnivore. I love meat. I do. I really do. I do
I
try
eat meat as
I
well.
try to
Yeah.
eat less of it and be very
Yep.
mindful of my impact on animals and all that. I do, and I know people are going to hate me for that, but like I do love meat. I love a good steak. But
Yeah.
listen, if I could live in a world where I could get a steak that was printed for me and it was the same,
Yeah.
and I didn't have to cut, and I could pretend that it just came from a tree because
Right.
it basically did. I would eat that steak in a heartbeat. I would
I
immediately
want to try.
switch.
I like
We
really want to
do.
try some of
I've
these
spent
things.
months. I go through a lot of cycles where we'll do like all of the meat alternatives, like, and that's just
Yep.
what we have in the house for months on
Yeah.
end. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. There's
100%.
tons of misinformation, and I'm sure if that does become a more popular thing, there will be a ton of misinformation for me to debunk on that subject as well.
There are some fake chicken patties out there that, listen, you
Oh,
couldn't tell me that's not
yeah.
chicken.
That area is getting so, yeah. I mean,
It's
like
getting
that
so good.
development is getting
Yeah.
so good. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Well, Erin, the food science babe, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your
Yeah.
time. If folks want to engage with you on social media, consume your content, and be very aware as you consistently find and debunk these ever more. There's always a new one. There's more information
Oh
spewing
yeah,
every day.
it's
How can they find you on social media?
yeah, so it's Food Science Babe. I'm on all the things, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. I've tried to do, not going very well, but yeah, follow me on
I'm
wherever.
terrible on YouTube.
Oh man, I
nobody
just, yeah,
nobody knows I exist on YouTube.
nobody knows I do either, but I do. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.